Hello, and welcome to the first episode 2 of Shifting the Narrative. My name is Christiaan Perez. I use he/him pronouns, and and I'd like to thank you for joining us for episode 2 of this four-part live stream series, where we explore how narrative shift works and why it matters. Now, in this first episode, on the second episode, we're going to be talking about what it takes to craft a winning long-term vision that helps us collectively reach the change that we need. The livestream series is produced by the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communications lab, and we work with partners through communication strategy as well as creative engagement to move hearts and minds for lasting policy and cultural change. We at the Opportunity Agenda understand how important it is to engage with artists, organizers, and researchers as powerful storytellers to shift the public discourse. It is with this goal in mind that we produce Shifting the Narrative, a report that explores narrative elements of 6 key issues: the death penalty, war on poverty, Blackfish, the Me Too movement, gun politics, and racial profiling. By exploring roughly 5 decades of narrative shift in these key issue areas, we sought to identify the essential and replicable elements of past successful narrative shift efforts and get a better understanding of how narrative changes and what we as advocates can do to shift them toward that vision. Now, last week, we had a broad conversation with members of the research and cultural influencer team on the 7 narrative shift recommendations. Today, we're going to drill in on 2 of those recommendations: building a long-term strategy rooted in values, as well as establishing your own frame to tell an affirmative story. To help us understand what a long-term vision looks like, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Adam Luna. He's the Vice President for Program Strategy and Impact at the Opportunity Agenda. Then we have Tania Mattos. She's the Policy and Northeast Monitoring Manager at Freedom for Immigrants. And finally, we have Robert Saleem Holbrook, Executive Director at Abolitionist Law Center. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, to get us started on how to construct a long-term vision for narrative shift, I'm going to pass the mic to Adam Luna. Adam is going to give us an overview about what shifting the narrative means related to these 2 specific recommendations, as well as to highlight 2 chapter examples from this report. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christiaan, and thank you, Tania Mattos, Saleem Holbrook, and thanks to all of you around the country for tuning in. My name is Adam Luna. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., where it is bright and sunny out, thank goodness. I serve as the VP of Programs at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'm recently here after decades of organizing campaigns for immigrant rights and on a variety of social justice issues. Over those years, I've tended to work on campaigns which are actually long fights, including many pieces of legislation, many elections, many situations out of our control. They've required a ton of crisis management, but always with an eye on the horizon line for what it is that we're building towards. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to join Tania, Saleem, Christiaan, and all of you to dive into this idea of narrative change over the long run and the importance of going on offense, of establishing an affirmative vision for what it is that you want. As a campaigner, I've been in fights which just seem to work. They seem to tap into something that seems to create like a glide path to victory. And for those of us who are engaged in social justice work, we've all had, I'm sure, too many experiences where everything just seems perfectly right. The case seems clear, the message straightforward, but it seems like we're walking through molasses where people just aren't connecting with what we're saying, they're not believing what we're saying, and no matter how many ways we try to put it, it just doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. The reason is that sometimes we're able to tap into, or that we run headfirst into, stories which each of us have in our heads, which help us make sense of the world. These are narratives, the big stories rooted in shared values and common themes that influence how audiences process information and make decisions. As powerful as these big stories are, they can run counter to one another, be conflicting, and all be in the same person's head at the same time. They're all around us, and they're what help to shape how each of us interpret what it is that we believe to be true or false, right or wrong, who we believe might be trustworthy or guilty or not. Narratives are conveyed not only in political and policy discourse, but also in news media, popular culture, on social media, and at dinner tables around communities. Gaining a better understanding of them and how campaigns have used them and shifted them over time to change our world is a big part of what it is that we're all about. As Christiaan described, this conversation follows a 6-part study where we looked at a range of narrative shift examples with the aim of identifying key lessons and developing recommendations for the field. Some of them were long-term narrative shift efforts that resulted in changes to both cultural thinking and policy. Others were shorter-term, single-issue focused campaigns with a particular policy goal that required a shift in narrative to achieve it. Our research methodology included in-depth interviews with stakeholders, massive document reviews, and scans and analyses of traditional and social media, hundreds of hours and thousands of pages. I highly recommend that you check out the reports, which are not thousands of pages long, don't worry, to learn more. Today, we're going to be digging into 2 key areas that emerged from the recommendations. The first is the importance of designing a long-term strategy that is rooted in values. Across the examples studied, clearly communicating what's at stake in the form of core values was a consistent method to disrupt oppressive narratives and to speak to their audience's value systems and emotions. They enabled campaigners to message around a common theme over the long run and use that framework to choose the stories and statistics they needed for a particular moment, for a particular campaign or messaging opportunity. In the case of the death penalty and racial profiling, the central values tended to be things like fairness and equal opportunity, equal treatment under the law. And it's those values, which most people can agree with, which were portrayed as being at risk unless campaign audiences took action. Instead of only listing statistics and assuming people knew the context in which they fit, advocates consistently tied arguments back to the systemic racial biases which cause statistically bad outcomes. That basic threat to values meant that arguing for small changes to systems that inherently perpetuate unequal treatment was less acceptable to core audiences and opened them up to possibilities for systemic change. The second recommendation we'll explore today is the value of going on offense and of telling an affirmative story on your own terms. It was clear from the studies that advocates were best positioned to gain ground, respond to unpredictable external variables, and weather increased activity of the opposition by adopting offensive communication strategies. In the case of anti-death penalty, anti-gun, and anti-racial profiling movements, going on offense really changed the game. Armed with an effective communication strategy, advocates can disrupt oppressive narratives by hitting them head on and resetting the terms of the debate to make considerable headway in challenging the efficacy of things like the death penalty and the myth of unbiased policing. While still being against something, the effect of campaigns was that the narrative started to become more about being for equal treatment and accountability. Today, Tania and Saleem will share more about their work on the ground in movements working to advance values of equal treatment and accountability. 2 of the case studies we analyzed were the campaign in the late 90s to name and stop racial profiling and the decades-long struggle to end the death penalty. The racial profiling case study describes the narrative shift that occurred in just 3 years between 1999 and 2001 and how advocates made it happen. It also describes the gradual weakening of resolve to end racial profiling in the aftermath of 9/11 and the reemergence of the anti-racial profiling narrative in the years since the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Efforts to control African Americans' mobility date back to the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to our shores. Racial profiling is a part of the everyday experience of Black and Brown people. But through intentional efforts, concepts like driving while Black and the term racial profiling itself skyrocketed in public attention, with articles referring specifically to driving while Black, increasing from just 72 articles in 1998 when they were just starting to intentionally popularize the term, to more than 300 in 1999, just 1 year later. This was the result of a concerted campaign by the ACLU and many others to disrupt the false narrative of what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the enduring myth of Black criminality. Within the framework of fighting for equal treatment and accountability, advocates set out to punch holes in the myths and create new laws to stop oppressive behavior and make the values real. On the death penalty, we looked at a narrative shift that happened over a period of almost 50 years. From 1972, a time when the death penalty was widely supported by the American public, to now, a time with growing concern about its application and a significant drop in support. It tells the story of how, over time, activists took aim at the false narrative that the death penalty works and pushed narratives based on fairness and equal treatment to change the game. They leaned into earned media strategies, strategic litigation, and in cultivating new spokespeople to make the case, and had an impact on changing the game and winning moratoriums in many states. The case study also lays out some of the, frankly, tactical challenges in working with short-term messages of reform with a long-range goal of abolition. And that's it for me to get us started, and I will turn it over to Christiaan.
Thank you, Adam. Now, of course, as Adam mentioned, these are just, he was recapping 2 of the chapters. There are 6 other chapters that I highly recommend you read. And the recommendations we're talking about are 2 of the 7. So this, like I said, this is a focused conversation on building that affirmative vision. And I highly recommend going to the website, which is that bit.ly down below. Or if you're watching this live, we've had a couple folks comment with the link. So click that link. The introduction chapter has all these recommendations I can read through, as well as some guidance about which other chapters you can possibly go deeper on. Now, keeping this conversation going forward, the next conversation is going to be with Tania Mattos. She's going to talk a little bit more about what building an affirmative vision looks like when it comes to immigrant detention. Tania.
Thank you, Christiaan. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Tania Mattos. I go by she, her, hers. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss some of the work that's been happening here in the Northeast within immigration detention. So first, I wanted to discuss the coalition that I work with, which is the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition, which we're a number of organizations that are part of this coalition, both on the New Jersey and the New York end. And we started this coalition about a couple of years ago, probably 2-3 years ago. And we, with the mission and with the vision of ending detention in the New York, New Jersey area. And so we started to work towards that. So we worked very closely to possibly ending the contract at Hudson. We support people inside and we organize with people inside these facilities. We also work on legislation that would end detention in the facilities in the states. And then we also go to county hearings and really run amok and give individuals and these counties that hold our people, we let them know what we want and our vision to close these facilities, right? So now our vision is to free them all. That's always been our vision, not only because of the conditions and that human beings should not be in cages, but on top of all this, the COVID crisis that we've had across the globe has really had an impact on all people detained. And so people within ICE custody have died because of this situation. Also, many people have gotten sick. And so not just us, but all around the country, there has been a major push to free them all. And right now we have one of the, in the last few months, we've had some of the lowest immigration numbers to date from a long time ago, from what people can remember. And what we want to do is we want to build a community and a world where we decarcerate and we build other systems that can benefit our communities. Within the immigration movement, we believe that individuals should not be detained for immigration purpose or for any reason, but especially for having waiting out for a court hearing or waiting for a decision from USCIS or a judge based off of their case in these cells. So we don't believe that should be the case. And instead, we want to build an alternative or a decarceration plan that is more holistic and more community-based, where individuals can lean on the support of the community and lean on the support of these structures that we build to help them in this process. Like individuals that are coming from seeking asylum, who are wanting to adjust their status or don't have status, they should not be met with carceration. And actually, quick update, some breaking news that happened today is that the Essex County Jail ended its contract with ICE just today, just a few hours ago. This is bittersweet in one way because the Essex County has gained a $11.4 million contract to expand its jail to hold other people in the facility. So not immigrants anymore, but other folks that would fall for immigration purposes, or individuals for immigration purposes. They won't be holding them in that facility anymore, but they will be continuing and expanding their facility to hold other people. So it is bittersweet, but we need to transition away from a carceral economy that keeps these facilities alive. And so now I want to focus on building power by strengthening relationships. So on the screen, you'll see an individual named Chris Pardesi. And so a large part of our work has been to build and to make connection, to build and to organize with people inside of these facilities. So Chris Pardesi is someone that is being held at Hudson County Jail right now. And he is one of many, many stories that we've encountered of individuals who have come across, have been detained in the facility due to interaction with police. So in his case, it was NYPD. He's a resident of Queens. He's about 37 years old. He has a family. And really, he's had a couple years of just racist interactions with the police, false accusations from his employer, false accusations from a restaurant owner, where they claim that he was involved in a matter that somebody ended up getting hurt. And so because he's an immigrant from Trinidad, he was in a system already. And when he went to jail, when he served his time in jail and he was held in those facilities, ICE then came to pick him up and take him to Hudson County. So, I mean, I wish I had more time to talk specifically about his case, but he really is a prime example of two racist systems collaborating and holding him hostage in this detention center, and him having to go through years of the criminal justice system that is broken and unfair and racist and white supremacist, and then having him land in an immigration facility afterward. So what I want to say is that at the end is that, well, you know, one thing I think we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes is how a little bit about how the criminal justice system sort of interacts with immigration and how we can learn from each other. And I do want to emphasize that it is very important for the Immigrant Rights movement to collaborate with the criminal justice system, with the criminal justice organizations and groups that are fighting to free all people and not just immigrants.
Thank you, Tania. I appreciate as well how you brought in the story of Chris. I think it's something that definitely is a very big part of building affirmative vision, so we can have a sense of the folks who are fighting for amidst all of this. I'd also casually mention that on May 26th, we're going to have another conversation about the importance of centering voices of those who are most impacted. And I think that this speaks to how we can identify intersectional solutions for these kind of problems. But transitioning from that, as Tania just mentioned, it's very important that we look at the relationship between the criminal justice system and the immigration system, and to help us understand a little bit more about how the criminal justice system has kind of gone awry. We're going to talk with Saleem Holbrook. He's the executive director at Abolitionist Law Center, and he's going to speak a lot more about the problematic nature that exists around sentencing in this country and extreme punishment. Saleem?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the narrative battle between the politics of redemption and the politics of treating human beings as exposable. In 1972, in the case of Furman versus Georgia, the United States Supreme Court banned the death penalty in the United States. The decision was the culmination of a decades-long struggle to end capital punishment in the United States. Also contributing to the banning of the death penalty was the national civil rights movement and its aggressive and unsettling counterpart, the Black Liberation Movement, that unapologetically confronted the racism inherent in American justice, which saw two separate justice systems, one for white people and one for Black people. Underneath the surface, a boiling national prisoners' rights movement was making strides in the courtroom through legal actions, challenging the conditions of their confinement and the deprivation of their constitutional rights. Internally, prisons and jails across America were on fire, represented best by the Attica uprising in 1971. All of these forces combined to make the death penalty untenable by 1972. In reaching its landmark ruling banning capital punishment, however, often overlooked is the fact that the ruling did not abolish capital punishment. It did not declare that the state cannot take a life. Rather, it invalidated all the death penalty sentencing schemes in the United States and made it that in order for states to reinstate the death penalty, they had to remove arbitrary and discriminatory language from their statutes. It was believed that the forces that supported capital punishment or sought to reimpose it would not have the political or moral capital to win the battle in the states to reinstate it. However, in just 4 short years, not only would capital punishment be reinstated in 1976, but in the same period, the forces that would give rise to mass incarceration were just embarking on a political gamble that would see the national prison population in the country rise from 200,000 in 1970 to over 2 million by the year 2000. How is it we went from banning one form of extreme sentence in 1972 to reinstating it in 76, but by the end of the 70s, implementing some of the most harsh sentencing schemes ever seen across the country? The short answer is what we call tough on crime and law and order politics became the dominant way of responding to poverty and crime, and they led to increasing criminalization, harsh prosecution, longer sentences, and the end of the rehabilitative model of prisons. These policies, however, were a direct response to the social activism of the 60s that disrupted the status quo of this country. It tied together the anti-Black, anti-civil rights sentiment within big government, with anti-big government sentiment to imply that there is no solution to urban unrest except police and prisons. In short, treat trauma with more trauma. Under this logic, human beings and entire communities trapped in systematic and generational poverty and racial discrimination were disposable. We lost the battle of values and narrative. The 80s saw the prison population and extreme sentencing explode as a crack in poverty in urban areas took off. The death sentence and harsh mandatory minimums were the treatment. 15 years after Furman, in 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutionally permissible to execute children over the age of 16. The 80s closed with the image of Black youth as the face of crime and drugs in the United States, despite the fact that whites accounted for the majority of drug users and arrests. The 90s opened with the 1991 U.S. Supreme Court decision that ruled life without parole sentences were permissible for nonviolent offenses. If the 70s and 80s were the growth of mass incarceration, the 90s were its period on steroids. Across the country, spurred on by the 1993 crime bill, states passed mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're out. The death sentence was expanded to over 50 new offenses. By 2000, the U.S. topped over 2 million people incarcerated. What did this population look like? The majority were incarcerated for what we termed violent offenses. 60% of the people committed to state prisons were for serious violent offenses. Are these prisoners disposable in this era of reform? 20% of Pennsylvania's prison population are geriatric. In 1980, there were only 40 lifers in Pennsylvania, age 60, with over 40 years in prison. Today, there's over 700. Are these prisoners disposable because of offense many of them committed decades in the past? What does it say when advocates and politicians write off entire classes of prisoners and communities because either the race or the offense, but then reject the fact that these prisoners who have served extreme sentences and have been released have the lowest recidivism rate of all defenders, including nonviolent drug defenders? What does this say about how public safety is not valued, but rather vengeance and fear is valued? In 2004, the United States Supreme Court overruled the 1986 decision allowing children to be executed. That ruling paved the way for the court's 2012 ruling in Miller versus Alabama that banned mandatory sentencing of children to life without parole. The court ruled that children were different than adults and could not be written off as incorrigible. It paved the way for over 2,500 children condemned as disposable and beyond redemption and who were sentenced to life without parole to be released. Hundreds of prisoners sentenced to life without parole as children from Philadelphia were released between 2016 and 2019. A study of those released by Montclair University found a recidivism rate of 1.14%. I am one of those men and women released. Not only was I sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison, but I was also facing the death sentence at the age of 16 for being a lookout to a drug-related homicide that happened on my 16th birthday in 1990. At one time, the state deemed my life disposable. However, those of us released lead our campaign, not with legal theory, but with values rooted in redemption, restorative, and transformative justice. We forced the highest court in the land to address the injustice of the sentence. However, even after our release, we continue fighting to demonstrate that redemption is not limited to children who committed their offenses decades ago, but is something all prisoners and human beings possess, and especially prisoners that have been in prison for 20, 30, and 40 years, and also to prisoners with capital offenses on death row. These are the values decarceration should be led by, and we can never forget that in the United States, victories won one day must be defended the next. Just last week, the present Supreme Court already started to roll back the 2012 Miller versus Alabama protections that prohibited children from being sentenced to life without parole. The way we respond to this is to continue uplifting the inherent value of all human beings, organize those values into a campaign, and dismantle the carceral state brick by brick. Justice should not be a game of fortune. It should be guided by values. Human beings are not disposable.
Thank you. I also appreciate you opening up about your experience with trying to reform the system, and also I understand it's a lot to process given the news developments of recent. I want to bring the rest of the panel back and just remind our audience that you can comment on the chat on this video with your questions. Obviously, bear in mind that the questions will be filtered through our team, so make sure you comment now so we have a chance to. And yeah, I think now to get things started, I actually want to piggyback off of Saleem's most recent, what we were just talking about defending those hard-won victories. Because that's, I think, always one of the struggles that we definitely saw if you look at the death penalty chapter in particular and the history that Saleem presented to us. There was a victory in the early 1970s, and we had virtually eliminated the death penalty at one point. And it was at the point that we had supposedly we were past the point of seeing capital punishment as even an option, yet somehow the opposition kind of rolled that all back. And so now we're at the point where we have to revisit extreme sentencing as a whole, because the efforts to advance extreme sentencing have been put forth even further through that law and order narrative. With that in mind, Saleem, I want to ask you to respond first since it's piggybacking, but of course I'm interested in Tania and Adam, what you have to say. But what are some examples of areas in which we need to be more proactive in defending those hard-won victories?
I think that touches on what this program is about, and that is we have to lead with a campaign that is based on values. And we have to be very explicit in defending those values and communicating to the state and to people that support that law and order approach that you can't treat trauma with trauma. It doesn't work. We have 40 years of examples of it not working, and we don't need another 40, right? So I think this is where we have to have that moment where you draw that line in the sand and not allow ourselves and our communities to be guided by fear, which a lot of those people who support these harsh sentencing, who support the continued incarceration of children for the rest of their lives and continue to support the death sentence, that's what they feed off. And we need to move more into a politics and a values that is not based on fear, but is based on addressing the trauma in our neighborhoods, not using police and prisons to treat that trauma, and making clear that human beings are not disposable. You cannot write, and we will not allow you to write our communities off as disposable communities that have people in them who can be just disappeared, whether it's through mass incarceration, whether it's through death row, or even if it's through an ICE detention center.
Tania, did you have anything you want to add to that in terms of the ongoing fights to end immigrant detention, and then also what it's going to take to, if we can ever get to that point, defend those victories?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment as an example. You know, right now there's a huge opportunity with what I mentioned about the perfect example of the Essex County Jail. I think that's a precise opportunity to discuss one, narrative change, to discuss the opportunities we have to really shift the narrative of are we celebrating this ICE contract being cut, but at the same time, you know, how are we pushing back on the fact that it's an expansion of a jail, and more people will be held there. And again, this is a jail that is notoriously horrible. There's a lot of accusations. I'm sorry, not accusations, but because I believe them. But there's a lot of stories coming out from people detained that there's been a lot of sexual and physical abuse in that facility, and so it's not really a win for us. And so we have to think about in the next couple of hours, how do we make that narrative shift to not break from the protest, from the movement that's happening now, to end all facilities and all detention, and to free them all.
Yeah, and I think also to that point, this kind of gets to the question of like who deserves, for lack of a term, who deserves to be saved, and that kind of respectability approach is like, it puts us in a position where we have to kind of give a value towards certain individuals being reforms being reaching them, certain individuals. And I guess my question there is, to what extent do we need to kind of check our own language and to check our own vision of reform to make sure that we're accounting for the folks who could still be forgotten at the end when we get to the goal, the vision that we're going for? How do we make sure that we don't leave certain folks out of the calculation? Mm-hmm. Adam? Yeah,
I can hop in on that, and kind of on this, and then on the previous one, on the previous question too. I think that one of the best ways to keep moving towards a long-range narrative goal, or really achieving the value shifts, making good on the values that we're all aiming for, and defending victories, is to, right after you win a victory, set your sight for the next victory. It's like, what's the next frontier of justice? So making that change in the Essex County Jail, like immediately then, boom, like how are we gonna shut the place down so that it doesn't become a place to harm all people? When the death penalty shifts happened in the early 70s, then what is the next frontier of fights against extreme punishment? What's the next rung of fights against punishment as a concept, to then ever get us ever closer to the goal? I remember after the immigrant youth movement won the victory of DACA, within a month there was then, okay, then now we want the next group of folks. We want the next group of parents and other family members to expand the victory. The idea was that the best way to defend the victory was to demand more. And of course, that certainly pissed off all the people in the administration and elsewhere who had just felt like they just delivered the victory. We just gave you what you want. What else do you want? Well, we want liberation is what we want. So to keep the momentum going, always heading in the direction of the long-range values that it is that we're trying to make real.
Now, Adam, you made a reference in your opening about sometimes it seems like the messaging sticks and sometimes it feels like we're walking through molasses. And this is it's always an interesting to be in the moment where you're like, people have to understand this message, but the people you're delivering this message to, it can be received very differently. And so I guess to that point, like sometimes we can have a vision of where we want to end up with a reform, but in the moment, we're looking at the immediate win. So to what extent can we or should we engage in informing the public about that ultimate vision of reform, of liberation, of abolition, of whichever the end vision is? To what extent do we need to incorporate that into our messaging versus the short-term immediate need? I thought to Adam.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh, is that me? I mean, both Saleem and Tania raised this, is just really the importance of leading with values, and leading with painting a picture of what the world looks like when we win, what the world looks like when, and paint it in a way that can invite a lot of people in so that they can feel a part of that vision. And then the problem that is articulated, the problem for the campaign or the thing that we're trying to change, then it has like a context into which it can fit. And it is that, and then that problem, what it does is it frustrates that shared vision that we've painted. That it is a device that can be used to help more people to see the stake that they have in making that shared value become real, and can add some urgency to the fight where otherwise people might be like, well, what does this have to do with me?
Tania, Saleem, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So very quickly, I encounter folks when people in the detention center were doing hunger strikes earlier this year. They were they were holding hunger strikes across 2 facilities, Essex and Hudson, and there were about 165 people that were doing these hunger strikes. And so some of the things that they would say is, well, we're not criminals. They treat us like criminals. And when in fact, they're the individuals that the general public would think that, oh yeah, they are the criminals that are in these detention centers. But for the purposes of our campaign and our vision and what we want to change, we had to work with them and organize and do political organizing with them to help them, to lead them to the point where they're able to say, no, I'm fighting for my freedom, but I'm also fighting for everyone in the facility's freedom. So instead, we were able to have them shift, like, they treat everyone here horrible, and focus on the abuses and focus on COVID and focus on XYZ that has happened, and not make that distinction between whether somebody's held for this purpose or not, because within these facilities, it can really be sort of divided, even amongst people who are detained for immigration purposes. But yeah, that's one example of how we've worked with people inside to make that narrative shift.
I'm going to add a yes and to that and then direct it to Saleem, because one of the things I really like that Saleem brought up was about the value of redemption, and the idea of using that value of redemption to challenge the extreme sentencing. So Saleem, could you perhaps elaborate on the role that played in currently playing?
Certainly. One of the challenges with narrative campaigns, it's a battle of language, right? And a lot of times too, I realize too, it's also an internal battle within our movement. So to share on several things, I can recall how when we were the anti-death penalty movement, when I was on the inside, how the sentence that they were advocating for as an alternative to the death sentence was life without parole, right? And I can remember so many of us being so frustrated, like, why are you advocating one form of the death sentence to another? It's because that's what life without parole is. But we had a struggle. We said, how can we communicate this to the public? Because life without parole sounds sterile. So let's call this what it is. So we started calling it death by incarceration, right? And we also started to tell folks in the anti-death penalty movement that it's not helping you and it's not helping us by you advocating this sentence as an alternative. What we should be talking about is how the state should not be in the business of killing people, right? Whether it's on death row or whether it's slowly through terminal sentences like death by incarceration. And that what we should also be talking about is how redemption, people should have the opportunity to show that they redeem themselves, that they're not the same person that they were 30, 40, or in some cases, like in Pennsylvania, people have been in prison for 50 years, right? So we had to do a very strong language shift, right? And make people uncomfortable with life without parole sentences, but also explain to our allies that, listen, we're only going to win this if we pull together and not pull apart in separate directions, right? You're trying to end one form of extreme sentences over there. We're trying to end it as well over here. It doesn't look good for us to be saying, oh, the sentence that those guys over there are serving is a sentence that our people should get. No, we don't. Why would you want to do that? So that was a battle, and I feel like it's really gained traction now. So that's one area. The other area, why redemption? I think because listen, redemption is something that runs deep within our communities. Redemption is, you know, when you're talking about prisoners who have been in prison for decades, this is not uncommon. Like, I'm not unique. There are many others like me who went into prison, served decades, got older, and want to come back home and contribute to their communities, right? And contribute to their families. This is common. And that's something that we want to lead with, right? And we also want to lead with, we do want to address public safety, but we want to turn public safety on its head, because the opposition uses public safety to justify more police, more prisons, right? More guns, more people in detention centers, right? We're saying, look, public safety for our communities is different. Public safety in our communities actually means releasing our elders to the communities so that they could stabilize some of our communities and families. But also, the people that we're asking to be released have the lowest recidivism rates of all categories of prisoners. So you obviously don't care about the safety of our communities if you are going to deny the segment of prison population that has the best chance of success from returning to our communities, because your communities and you are trapped in this cycle of vengeance and playing political ping pong with our communities and stoking fear. So that's another part of this campaign, and why we also talk about redemption and public safety. Again, it's that narrative. I mean, it's that language battle within the narrative battle, because that's what a narrative is. It's language shift. And before you could shift the politics, you have to shift the language. You have to translate the system not just the system that we want to be in or that we want to see, but you also have to translate the present system to people so that they could see exactly what they're fighting for now.
Yeah, and I also, so for the audience who's watching, I know we're getting close on time, so I will say if you post your comment in the chat, if we can't get to it during this live stream, we'll get to it in the follow-up email. So remember, if you haven't already, sign up on our website for this event. You'll get a follow-up email with more resources, more information, and you'll also be updated for when our next live stream is taking place, where we're going to talk about more focus specifically on the war on poverty and on ending the drug war. So actually it relates to this conversation as well, but that one is going to focus on dismantling problematic narratives, which I know you two will probably have a lot, all three of you will have a lot to say on this, but for now, when it comes to talking about building that affirmative vision, we are seeing a lot of this like kind of percolating even more, especially within the past year, where the idea of defund the police has grown to such a degree. At the same time, the opposition to it seems to have taken on a more dismissive approach. Like this is just a speculative approach where some people will just look at this defund the police notion and think that, oh, that's just a pie in the sky, never attainable. But then at the same time, we're seeing unattainable things happening on a regular basis. Like previously, you told me blank would have happened. It's happening now. So with that in mind, how do you see the building of an affirmative vision going into making sure that the alternatives to the police are incorporated into your respective movements? Because on the one hand, we're talking about immigrant detention, where racial profiling does lead to obviously like stacked up sentencing, stacked up harm that is done towards immigrants. And then to the other extent, we see racial profiling playing out when it comes to the types of sentencing that we see and extended sentencing, death by incarceration. So I guess, Tania, I'm going to throw it to you, and then Saleem, Adam, if you have something to add at the end, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So for the immigrant rights movement, yeah, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to this subject. My opinion, and I think that this has been the trend, is because we're detention hasn't existed for very, very, very long of immigrants to the level that it is today. But I think that the criminal justice system has, or the criminal justice groups that have been working on this for decades, right? And so I think that when we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, we should be able to contribute to those conversations about the evolution of closing all facilities, all cages, all detention centers, all jails. But for example, we see that again around the Essex shutdown. I looked on Twitter, and there's still people that are celebrating, not mentioning the fact that there are more people that are going to be detained. Perhaps immigrants themselves, but they won't be held there for immigration purposes, but they will be held on other counts or accusations. But I think what we're missing is incorporating that criminal justice sort of already worked on, already fleshed out for decades, already systems of decarceration. And I think we have a very unique moment right now where the narrative is there of defunding, abolishing the police, but in New York City in particular, there's the media is really showing, and I'm sure this is happening along with a lot of countries, but there's also like a lot of hurt happening in the streets right now, and a lot of houseless people in the streets right now. This is a prime opportunity to put into practice exactly what we've been preaching about, having it be a restorative justice sort of way of supporting people, because police doesn't prevent crimes from happening. They just go to try to, solve the situation, or not even solve the situation, but just address the situation and incarcerate people. But police does not, they don't do anything to prevent this from happening. So it's just a prime opportunity for us to go ahead and put into effect all these strategies that have been built in the past decades from the criminal justice groups.
Yeah, thanks. And that's the loaded question, Adam, that we're dealing with in Philadelphia. Because as Tania said, police don't prevent harm. Police don't prevent crime. Police come and clean up the aftermath, right? And in our city right now, we're approaching probably on pace to have 600 homicides this year in Philly. There's already been like 130 something this year alone. I think the number is probably like at 150. We have to address that, but the way that you address that is not with more trauma, not with more police, because in the past we've shown that it does not work. So yeah, I totally support defunding police. I'm a abolitionist. I support abolishing police, but in that process, we are going to have to come up with ways that we can deal with this trauma in our communities that do not involve the police. And those opportunities are there. We can support many of these groups that are doing harm prevention work in our communities, violence interrupters. We could support more mental health ambassadors in our neighborhoods to deal with these cases of mental trauma that when police arrive on the scene, it's pretty much statistically guaranteed that it's going to escalate into some type of violence. And the only question is it going to be fatal, right? It's going, So, that's how we have to deal with our narrative work around defunding, as well as police abolition. But also too, recognizing that all of our campaigns to keep human beings out of cages, and to recognize the inherent worth and value of all human beings is tied together. So whether it's seeking decarceration of people in prison for social offenses, or closing down ICE detention centers, all of these are connected. And one thing we certainly do not want to do, and that is, as we are chipping away at the carceral state and decarcerating, we don't want in its shadow undocumented people becoming the new mass incarceration, because this will be a population that would be invisible. It would be a population that would have no rights. And it will be a population that will be scattered across the country. I don't want to use the term in concentration camps, but they would essentially be isolated in camps across the country, an entire industry. And private prisons, this is what they want, because private prisons do not constitute a large problem when it comes to state and federal prisoners. They're less than 7% of the total population. However, if they could get their hands on those contracts governing undocumented people, that is something that they would be happy to build an entire industry just for undocumented people. So for me, that's something that I saw going back to 2016, that was a new danger that was arising, because I hate to say this, that a lot of people who use race as a wedge issue, they kind of beat us up. Like, you can't use black people too much anymore. That horse died, right? Like, association of black people with crime, that won elections, in the 80s, into the 90s, into the early 2000s. They shifted that now to undocumented people, to Latinx people, to brown people. That's who if we're not careful, could start bearing the brunt, because these populations are unprotected by the Constitution. So that's something that we should really have our eyes on in the future, because victories one day must be defended the next. And just because we seem to have removed someone who was bent on building up that industry from power, there are many others in the wake who would gladly resurrect that narrative.
And see, we're getting close on time, and I know Adam you got the next mic, so I'm gonna do a wrap up question and ask y'all to go one by one if there's any last words you want to say. I'm gonna pull a question from the chat, actually, from Shelley Spiegel Coleman. She asks, how do you come together on identifying the values and the language that you're using when it comes to building this affirmative vision? Now, this will so answer the question and also add in any finishing thoughts that you may have. Adam?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Tania, and thank you, Saleem and Christian, for joining us today and for engaging in this rich conversation. Getting right into the question, you just got to get around the table and work it out. And you have to have conversations with people who are directly impacted with the issue at hand, and ask them what they want. You know, I found that you know, the people closest to the pain are often the closest to the solutions and the breakthroughs and the innovations that seem to stump everybody else. So really engaging in conversation with people who are directly impacted, engaging in conversation with people across who have some skin in the game in the fight, and work it out. On our website, we have some frameworks for being able to kind of map things like this out. So I encourage you to check it out. But it can be done. There are many, many examples, and it really is exciting to think about what it is that we can all do if we work together on things like Saleem has described, of like redefining safety. Like what does safety look like when everyone is actually safe from violence perpetrated by the state and by police officers and others? It really opens up a lot of possibilities that a lot of folks can get behind and can be really exciting.
Tania, Saleem?
Yeah. Yes, so narrative shifts. Thank you so much for that question, Shelley. One, I think that we've been in New York around immigration and you know, ending immigration detention. We're a little bit behind actually from a couple of states, and so we've had to have very difficult conversations with many parties, including some attorneys that don't agree with that idea of closing detention centers. And so we've had to have conversations internally, externally, on social media, through press releases, and sometimes it's one-on-one conversations. And so it's about pushing the narrative. Everything that's happening on the ground is so important. Protesting is so important. I'm a huge believer. I'm an organizer at heart, and I believe in, you know, protesting, trying to do that narrative shift on the ground and on Twitter is super important, right? As well. And yeah, in addition to that question, how do you become, how do we ensure that languages don't, or words don't become buzzwords, is one, I think it's putting the work behind it. So yes, it is a lot of work. It is a lot of pushing, but I think at the end, when it comes from people who are directly impacted, when it comes from movements, then I think that there comes a point where everyone has to shift, or is forced to shift, fortunately for us.
And I would just say real quickly that the way that we come together to identify the values in the language is to come together, to seek out our commonalities. Oftentimes we seek out and identify our differences, but that's something that we should do. We should seek out our commonalities, our common problems, the common injustice that our communities are facing, and then identify the values that we share collectively, and more importantly, that we are willing to fight for. But I think that the most important thing is to come together, because oftentimes that's actually the most difficult part, seeing that all of our issues, all of our struggles are united, and there's no walls of separation within our communities, that all of this is weaved together like a tapestry, like those indigenous blankets that we see. That's how our communities are. There may be many different strands, threads, and colors in that blanket, but they all are united. And one thing I just want to close with too is that Tania and I were just talking about what unites us, right? And we see an epidemic of police violence in this country. And all of us saw that video of Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old who was killed in New York, shot in the alley. That could have been any of us. That could have been a brown kid. That could have been, I mean, that could have been a black youth. That could, you know, that could have been me. When I saw that video, that was me, 13 years old, out at night, a young kid, did not understand the consequences of his actions, just being out that late that night with a cop who perceived every black and brown person out at that time of night as the enemy. That, you know, that's who Adam Toledo was to that officer, an enemy that night. So that could have been all of us. That could have been anyone in our communities. And when we start identifying those commonalities and that we don't want any of our children to suffer that type of fate, I think that's when we will start coming together and identifying the values and language in the world that we want to fight for.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reminding us of the interconnected issues that we're all struggling against. So Robert Saleem Holbrook from Abolitionist Law Center, as well as thank you as well to Tania Mattos from Freedom for Immigrants and Adam Luna from the Opportunity Agenda. As we mentioned, the Shifting the Narrative report, which you can see scrolling down below, click that bit.ly in the comment. You can click that link, go to the report, read the whole thing. This is, as I mentioned, this is an ongoing series. So 2 weeks from today, we will be talking about the dismantling problematic narratives with an emphasis on the war on poverty and the war on drugs. So thank you everyone who joined us for this episode, to our panelists, to our audience. I hope we can keep the conversation going for how we can keep shifting the narrative into building that affirmative vision so that hopefully we can be in that moment. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you.